So what I wanted to move on about is when the role of immunity and the differences, some of the differences that we see in different rainfall pattern zones and how that impacts where and when we're likely to see this classical worm scouring where the sheep are just not coping with the worm burdens that they're developing. And what this slide shows is it shows the pasture growth rates for coaching in Western Australia. So classic medium to high rainfall zone, Mediterranean environment. And the reason that I'm showing pasture growth rates and not feed on offer on the ground is that pasture growth rates are a bit of a proxy for the conditions where we think that conditions are going to be good for the larval survival and persistence on pasture, okay? So when we've got pasture growing in a Mediterranean environment, it means that we've got a few things in that system. We've got enough warmth that the pastures are growing, and we've got enough moisture. And both of these things are going to really favour the development of larvae in this same system. So as you can see, there's basically this seasonal pattern where we've got the hot, dry summer, not very favourable for larval development in the same sense that it's not favourable for pasture growth. And then through, we get this break. The break will vary sometime between April, May, June, hopefully. And then we get this, this rise in pasture growth, but also rise in pasture challenge that then goes through the winter and spring and then declines once again. And again, just looking at the pictures, what I'm showing is the conditions that we face in Western Australia, parts of South Australia with those Mediterranean environments, hot, dry for part of the year, cool and wet for the other parts of the year. And the ticks on these underneath are just showing you the times when we know that we've got a higher risk of larval transmission to the sheep, okay? So we've got this period in Western Australia with about 4 months where we can be fairly confident that we're getting larval challenge, periods through the hot summer where we know that there's going to be very little larval challenge, and then we've got this variation in between. Okay, so taking that one step further, what we've got here is the times of the year when we know that we're going to be getting larval challenge. In a West Australian environment, probably again in the medium rainfall zone, we can probably shorten that the further we go out into the cropping zones, and then comparing that to Victoria. And the key point here is that we know that young sheep need about 12 weeks or 3 months of continual larval exposure to develop a solid immunity to the parasites. Okay, and underneath what I've shown is the classic times or the spread that we typically see for lambing in this zone. So we know that the most of the lambs are going to be born sort of May, June, July, okay, in that period. The lambs will take a few weeks after birth to start really starting to graze, starting to take in those larvae, and that's when they can start developing that immunity. But we know that they need 3 months of exposure. So at least in Western Australia, if we've got lambs and we, quite a high proportion being born in July, we know that they need 12 weeks. It's quite possible and quite likely, in fact, that in the first year they're not going to get that full exposure to the parasites that they need to attain a solid immunity, carrying them into the second year. So the consequence of that is, at least in our Mediterranean environments, that sheep in their second year as yearlings, sheep in their second year as yearlings may or may not have a solid immunity. And what that means is that we're quite likely to have a high, or we have to have a very high index of suspicion when we've got scouring hoggets, so scouring yearling sheep, to use probably an easier terminology, is that we need to consider that those sheep in that environment may not have attained immunity. Now I'm going to flip back to John to really contrast that to the high rainfall zones, the winter rainfall zones, and the uniform rainfall zones.
Look, I guess in the southeast of Australia, the pattern is, the overall pattern is similar, but we're extending it out. The time when larval pickup can commence is a little bit earlier and pretty consistently starts in April, even with a little bit of moisture there. But occasionally, earlier on the year, we get spikes of pickup over summer, and that's not uncommon. But in saying that, the period where larval pickup extends is certainly longer than Western Australia, but obviously once you get into spring it starts to be diluted. But we can still, certainly in the southern cooler areas, we can still get quite a lot of larval pickup going into November. It's certainly more like in northern Victoria, it's more like it's more like the Western Australian Mediterranean thing with hotter, drier, where the season cuts out earlier. But with regard to that whole issue with lambing, obviously, look, we have a spread of producers lambing from May right through to where we more advocate in sort of winter lambing for the prime lamb flocks and late winter, early spring for the merino flocks. So again, a lot of the similar sort of picture in terms of with regard to the development of immunity. Some young lambs have had ample exposure in their first winter, but certainly the later lambing flocks certainly don't. So you go through from them the following year, they may or may not have developed a resistance, and usually, certainly earlier on in the following growing season, we're highly suspicious of just straight out normal worm burdens developing whilst they're still developing immunity. But I'll hand back to Carolyn.